The Washington, D.C. shooter slash terrorist that murdered the two Israeli embassy staffers in front of the Jewish Museum in May is now potentially up for the death penalty. The reform movement's official political arm, the RAC, came out yesterday with a strong statement against this death penalty, quoting and saying that the death penalty is a stain upon civilization and our religious conscience, and adding in that for 2,000 years, Jewish tradition has found capital punishment repugnant, and we continue to do so today. I think the reform movement is incorrect, both morally in their understanding of the death penalty and also, albeit in a little bit of a nuanced way, in terms of their understanding of Jewish tradition vis-a-vis the death penalty. Let's discuss it. One, I think it's just a misfiring of justice to spend even a minute worrying about this guy. If we do have the death penalty at our disposal, the death penalty should obviously be reserved for the worst of the worst among us. This DC terrorist slash shooter is, of course, one of the people in our society that should get the death penalty. Studies seem to be conflicted. Social scientists and criminologists do not seem to be able to agree on whether or not the death penalty actually is a disincentive of people in the future committing a crime. But there are a lot of convincing studies that seem to say it is a minor disincentive, especially because even if somebody has life in prison, there are potential ways that they can get out after 25, 30 years on things like parole and when sentences are up, or if judges change, or if presidents change, or anything like that. Crazy situations one can imagine in the future. Obviously, if somebody is killed, it doesn't matter who the president might be in 20, 25 years. And so ethically, even if there is the tiniest % chance that this is going to disincentivize somebody from doing this in the future, we of course should just kill this guy. I actually feel the same way about torture. It's one of the interesting things. I've never understood why liberals are so against using torture in war. Let me give you an example. If Israel captures a Hamas terrorist, or the U.S., captures an ISIS or Al-Qaeda terrorist, and you know that by torturing that person, you can save many future lives by either gaining intel to prevent terrorist attacks or allowing a war to progress more swiftly, I think of course you should do that. I actually think it's crazy that we have all of this discourse that says you're not allowed to torture terrorists. I think this is another application of liberals having misfiring of justice. And again, liberal society cannot allow a fully open door to the most illiberal people in the world, aka Hamas types, right? I believe the same thing about Mahmoud Khalil. I did a whole podcast discussing this, but liberalism cannot be open and accepting of every single ideology, because then it will get increasingly eroded by the strong illiberal and anti-liberal perspectives, and then the entire society will cease to be liberal. And so the very fact that the reform movement is even wasting ink, spending time worrying about the fact that this terrorist is going to get the death penalty, again, there are many better things that the Jewish community can and should be doing with their time. The Jewish case is a little bit more interesting, and I wanted to spend a couple of minutes discussing it. One, it does bear mentioning that the Torah is obviously full of the death penalty for a whole variety of things that almost anybody here can and should feel uncomfortable about it, right? I don't need to go through a list here, but, one obvious example is somebody who breaks the Sabbath, somebody who curses their parents, somebody who murders, right? There's a whole list of things that would earn you the death penalty. Now, it is true what the reform movement's stance was, that for the last 2,000 years, Jewish tradition has essentially vetoed the death penalty. I'll talk about first how and why they did it, and then in the second half, I'll talk about why it's not really true to say that. In terms of how and why they did it, the rabbis in the Talmud often act as, reformers, right? Not to be confused with the modern reform movement, but Judaism today is refracted through the eyes of the rabbis. That's why many people actually refer to contemporary Judaism as Rabbinic Judaism, as opposed to, say, Second Temple Judaism or Biblical Judaism. There's a lot to say there. But the rabbis in the Talmud essentially add legal stipulation after stipulation to effectively render the death penalty completely moot and completely neuter it. I'll give you one example. There's a lengthy debate in the Talmud about how often a court would actually put somebody to death. And one rabbi says, if I had been on the court, I never would have put anyone to death. And the other students ask, how is that possible? And he would have said, well, say there was a case of a murder, say, person A murdered person B, and let's say everybody saw it, right? Everyone saw person A stab person B with the knife. Well, technically, the judge could say, how do we know that technically person B died due to the thrust of the knife? Perhaps person B already had a hole in their heart in the exact place that person A stabbed them, and it wasn't actually person A's knife that killed him. The guy died a second before person A actually, swung down on their knife. And the rabbis say, essentially, that's how we would get people off the hook. It's a fascinating statement that does highlight the rabbinic discomfort with the death penalty. Again, there are ample other cases, just another one from the Talmud. If everybody in a court, there would be 23 people that would govern capital punishment cases in the times of the Sanhedrin in ancient Jerusalem. If all 23 of them said guilty, the person was immediately acquitted, because there's a principle that you actually need to have some discussion and debate, and somebody needs to defend the person. You can imagine this as sort of a parallel principle to the American idea that everybody has the right to have a representation by a lawyer, right? So the Talmudic equivalent was there weren't lawyers, but there were different judges, and you needed to have at least one judge who was willing to believe that the defendant was innocent. And so again, the rabbis say, essentially, even a case as obvious, say, as the DC shooters, we should not give the death penalty. Now, the interesting thing to note about the Talmud is the Talmud was being written in a time when Jews didn't actually have power over the civic legal sphere. In other words, by the time the Mishnah and subsequent Talmud was being writing, this was all theoretical. Jews did not have the power in Babylonia in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century to actually put other people to death, right? Oftentimes these cases would be done in the wider, right, if we are talking about the land of Israel, the Greco-Roman courts. If we're talking about Babylonia, the, Zoroastrian and Sasanian, wider Persian courts. And so many historians, and I actually talked to one of them, I talked to somebody named Chaim Saiman about 4 or 5 months ago, who wrote this book called The Rabbinic Idea of Law. I actually have it right here for on YouTube here. And one of the things that Chaim Saiman argues quite convincingly is that the depiction of Jewish law that the rabbis give is very much sort of the idealistic, intellectual view of Jewish law. And so the rabbinic ideal would be for there to be no either death penalty or another ancient punishment was whipping people with lashes. And so the rabbinic ideal as delineated in our text and Talmud is to say none of that. What Chaim Saiman and, other Jewish historians have done before is noted that at times in history, when people actually did bring civic cases or civil cases to local Jewish courts, they would apply what we might call meta-legal principles to say, well, technically, all P, right, on the basis of just Jewish law, we're not allowed to kill this guy or punish this guy or give this guy lashes, but for the good of the community or for the sake of community, again, for a value that can't be reduced to Jewish law, but sort of a meta idea, we actually need to punish this guy anyway. And that's how Chaim Saiman argues that this dialectic between the legal ideal and the practical was balanced. And so the Reform movement is correct that the Jewish legal ideal for the last 2,000 years was to never have the death penalty. But in terms of practice, right, the rabbis that were talking about the legal ideals, they're not necessarily talking about civic law as put into practice. So I'm not convinced that most of the rabbis in the Talmud, had they been alive today in America in 2025, it's not such an obvious case that they would all come out against the death penalty. So again, the DC shooting was so horrific. I obviously did a video about it last May that I would love for you to watch if you hadn't seen it. One part, I just think it's just frustrating that one of the things that liberal Jews all of a sudden, need to care about is making sure this terrorist does not get put to death, right? So I think I'm just generally frustrated, along with, many of the people who have seen those stories. But I also think it does open the door for a very nuanced conversation about the wider ethics at play in the death penalty, whether or not it's good generally for society. There's also another question I tried digging into, and I actually found this out. I was a little surprised, but it seems that the cost, right? Say somebody's going to be in jail for 30 years or get put to death. It's not obvious that putting them to death is the cheaper option, because I think that's also a concern. Listen, I am a, taxpayer, along with you, right? We pay our money to the federal government. And if this DC shooter terrorist spends 30 years in prison, that is some of our earned taxpayer money to go for paying for this guy's essential rent and food, right? That's crazy. So obviously, if putting this guy to death is just, snap of the finger, and that's going to be a lot cheaper, I do think that we have to take that into the equation. Turns out it's not such an obvious case, because once you have lawyer fees and legal fees and then, medical, all of this stuff, that can actually rack up to be millions of dollars. Yes, it is insane that millions of dollars of federal taxpayer money is going to punishing somebody for terrorism, right? There are probably cheaper ways to kill people. Either way, I don't tend to have, extremely strong opinions about the death penalty, yes or no. I do think all that I really care about is whether or not it will actually disincentivize people in the future. The research seems to lean on the side that, if we want to err on the side of caution, I think we should use the death penalty. Obviously, it should be reserved for very obvious cases. There have been some very horrific cases, from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, back when they would use things like, fully trusting eyewitness evidence, which, much psychological research has told us that, witness evidence is basically bunk, because people make up memories and can't be trusted, even if they mean well, right? Let alone if people are just trying to frame other people. But even if people are trying to remember something, people are not very good at that. But yeah, it does seem like if we err on the side of caution, assuming somebody is for sure guilty, which, in the case of the DC shooter, he was for sure guilty. We know we have the right person. This isn't just, we are incriminating him based on, some blood found at the, crime scene. In that case, yes, we should not put people to death. But in the case that it's obvious that this guy did it, everybody knows that he did it, just put him to death and, let's save the crocodile tears.